If you ask a Christian who the figure of Jesus was, one of the most common ways to answer the question is to quote John 1 verse 1. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and if you memorized it the way I memorized it when I was a kid, the Word was God. Now, I've seen some videos from different creators lately talking about what John 1:1 means and how it should be translated, including one from one of my favorite creators, Dan McClellan, who argues that what we should actually be saying here is the Word was divine. And this got me really interested in the question because I hadn't really thought very much about it in the past. So what I want to do in this video is unpack the question of John 1:1 and do a dive into some of the sources and historical background. That sounds freaking nerdy and boring already, but I promise it'll be fun. I want to do a dive into some of the sources to explain how we answer this question and how we should properly translate John 1 verse 1. And spoiler alert, I really don't think it's that easy to figure out exactly how to translate this. I think it's complex and I'm not even sure if I have a really good answer for it, but I'm going to try my best. So my plan here is to show you the problem in John 1:1 and try to explain the Greek grammatical question in a way that might make sense to you even if you don't read Greek. I want to explain some of the historical background of how we would even go about understanding what John is trying to say in John 1:1, and I want to make some suggestions on maybe how we could translate this. So if you're up for all that, let's dive in. Before we start, my name is Chris. I have a Master of Divinity, a Master of Arts in Theology, and a PhD in Christian origins, and I talk about all things ancient and modern Christianity, so if you haven't done so yet, take a second, subscribe to the channel. Now, without further ado, let's get going on this question. So to begin, the very first question that we kind of are faced with is why there is even a question at all. And I think if you don't actually read Greek, it isn't really clear why this is even an issue. And I first learned about this question because when I was a teenager, I did a lot of preparation to argue with Jehovah's Witnesses. I'm sorry, it wasn't my proudest moment, but I was a budding young apologist and I wanted to argue with people who thought differently than me about the Bible. And one of the things that I remember learning is that unlike my translation, which said in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God, the Jehovah's Witness translation, it said the Word was a God. And this was just like infuriating to me. And I mean, I didn't know anything about it, but I knew they had to be wrong because it was different from the way I was taught to read the Bible. I want to look at the Greek text of John 1 verses 1 to 2 first to even understand why there is a question. So I'm going to have to do this kind of like walking you through the basics of Greek grammar, and I'll try to do it as well as I can for somebody who doesn't understand Greek very well. And the other thing you should know is like I use Greek, but I'm also not a translator. Like there are people who have way better knowledge of Greek than I do. So maybe this is a good thing for the purpose of this video because maybe I'm like, you know, the teacher is like one lesson ahead of their students, but I hope I should be able to show you the issues and how to answer the question anyway. So we have this fantastic opening to John, and it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. I'll just read that in English, but the question is here. The Word was God. And these Greek words, we actually have this flipped upside down. So kai just means and. Theos is the word for God. Ein means was, and hologos is the Word. So it's actually, in English, we say the Word was God, in this translation, but it's actually in Greek backwards. It actually says basically God was the Word. Now, this is the question. And the important thing for somebody who reads Greek is we're looking for something here that's not here, and that is a definite article. So usually, not always, as we're going to see, but often when you're writing nouns in Greek, Greek has a definite article attached to a noun. Definite article is the, right? So if I look here, proston theon, this is a definite article. So it literally in Greek says literally to or with the God. And over here too, ton theon, the God. So this isn't how we would translate this in English. We would just say God because the God doesn't quite make the same sense. If you're looking at a text from antiquity that isn't Jewish or Christian, you'll often see people translate this as the God in English. So we say like the God or the gods. So it's not completely out of the realm of our thinking to translate like this. But here, kai theos has no the in front of it. There's no definite article. And in Greek, there is no indefinite article. So in English, I could say the God or a God, depending on my Canadian accent. In Greek, if there is no definite article, if it doesn't say the God, the most basic way to think about how to translate this, and I'm not saying this is the answer, but the first thought is usually that if a word doesn't have an article, we read it as a, indefinite, a God. So the word was a God. And I think this is actually what the New Living Translation is trying to get at by saying, okay, there's no article here. We would expect this to say halagos ein, or sorry, ha theos ein halagos. So the God was the word would be the, and not the proper way because there are other ways to write this. But for somebody who doesn't know too much Greek, this would be the way to think about this. But there's no article here. So the word was a God, or a God was the word. However, this is an interesting Greek question. And as it turns out, it's a very complicated theological question. So I hope I've got you on the hook, at least for understanding what the question is. The question is, how come there is no article here in front of theos? And how should we translate this? Is it a theological question? Is it a grammatical question? Is it just that John was being sloppy and just left it off, which I don't actually think is the case, but maybe you could argue it. So the way I see it, there are three different ways to read this text based on Greek grammatical rules. Okay, so the first is just reading this as saying the word was God. Basically, like we're talking about God, the God, can I say the Father, or, in the Jewish tradition, like the one true God, like the word is God, the word was God. So that's one way we could argue might be a way to translate this, that this is actually talking about the figure of God. The second way to read this would be to say that theos here is actually functioning as a way to signify that the word was divine or godlike in quality. So rather than talking about the figure of God or the person of God, we are talking about the quality of divinity. The word was divine. Now, I know there's a whole bunch of theological questions there too, but I'm going to move on because I just can't spend too much time here yet, but we'll get to it, I promise. And the third way that you could translate this is the way that Jehovah's Witness Bible translated it as the word was a God. So this kind of sounds like you're saying it was like one of many because it's indefinite. In terms of understanding this problem, those are the three options. And all of them come from the difficulty of knowing why John left the article off here and what that is supposed to mean, why it says basically God instead of the God. That's the question. And as it turns out, there's a lot theologically hanging on this question. The one thing I should say as I'm getting started is that we need to ask this question in and of itself. Like, what is the author of John trying to get at? It's very easy for us to put on our theology hat and think of the Trinity and be like, oh yeah, I know the answer to this. Father, Son, Holy Ghost, like a triangle, or maybe like an egg, if you were given that analogy, which I was when I was a kid, which is probably a terrible affront to Trinitarian theology, but it's the way that I was sort of taught to think about it. So let's remember that the Trinity wasn't formulated until the 4th century as a doctrine. There was lots of stuff leading up to that in a couple hundred years of Logos theology that helped to develop the way that a lot of us inherited to think about the Trinity. So I'm trying to see here the writer of the Gospel of John, who's trying to express something to us. And this writer, probably 1st century, maybe 2nd century, very Jewish. The Gospel of John has it shows a really good knowledge of maybe the Septuagint. There might even be translated Hebrew Bible in here. Like the author of the Gospel of John obviously had some Jewish background and some knowledge of the Septuagint. So there's a really obvious question as you're writing this gospel. How do you get from Jesus traditions, from narratives, to this kind of theological statement about who Jesus is? And I've already said it's possible that the author of John read Hebrew, translated Hebrew. Some of the translations in John don't completely line up with the Septuagint, which is the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible or the Greek translation. So we don't even exactly know what Bible John was using. It almost seems like the author was using multiple scriptural sources, which is impressive and probably displays a pretty good knowledge of Greek and maybe even Hebrew. But I want to look at some of the ways that this theos, which is the Greek word for God, gets translated in the Septuagint. So we have a Hebrew Bible. This is the text of the Hebrew Bible on the left. We have a Greek translation that kind of came out probably 3rd, 2nd centuries BC, Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And what you have is this word theos gets picked up, the Greek word for God got picked up and adopted and applied to the Hebrew Bible. Now, there's one more thing I forgot to mention. The question of Anarthrous is a really weird word. Anarthrous just means without an article. So often if you're looking at somebody calling this an anarthrous noun, it's just saying that the word theos doesn't have an article. So it's just a fancy way of saying no article. but it still means something definite. So if we're trying to imagine John as somebody who's reading the Septuagint Hebrew Bible, I think it would be like an interesting question to ask, what do you actually see in the Hebrew Bible? And especially because, remember, in Greek, usually theos would have it would have hotheos. It would have an article attached to it. But what happens is the translators of the Hebrew Bible had some very, can we say, difficult choices to make, because they're trying to translate Hebrew into a Greek word, and they're trying to use the Greek language to express things in Hebrew that aren't always clear to express. One of the most obvious questions in Hebrew is that there are multiple names for God in Hebrew. We have Elohim, we have the divine name Yod He Vav He, which in English people usually just say Yahweh. We have other words like El, like we have different words for God in the Hebrew Bible, and somehow these need to get translated into Greek. And I think this is a really good place to start, because I think it's pretty obvious that the Greek translator of the Septuagint were influenced in writing Greek, and especially using this word theos, they were influenced by their own theological goals for how to translate the Septuagint. So I just grabbed this here. This is, I'll always start with the English, maybe just to keep it simple. The Lord will be me to God. Yahweh will be my God. So here it says le Elohim, which just basically is a preposition. This lamed is a preposition. So as God, the Lord will be my God. It's like saying the Lord will be as God to me in Hebrew. And in Greek, this gets almost literally translated like he will be to me, the Lord, as God or a God. So it's kind of tricky to translate this directly, but in this case, one of the things that jumps out right away is that the Greek translator has opted to not include an article here. This is eis theon, and if I was to expect an article here, I might expect eis ton theon, which is, I think, what you get up here, ton theon. So this article is not here. So what we actually find when we start to look through how the Septuagint translators translated Hebrew into Greek is they often drop the article. And it seems to be for a couple reasons. I'm going to go through a bunch of examples, but just right at the front, let me say it seems to be for a few reasons. One reason, there seems to be something just stylistic, that I think sometimes it's like in Hebrew, there's something called a construct chain, which gets translated into a Greek genitive. Oh my God, I'm going to lose you if you're not a nerd on grammar like I am. But let's just say it's the grammar of Hebrew. Sometimes it's tricky to represent it in Greek, and sometimes they drop the definite article in Greek. Now, here we have another example that shows up in Exodus and in Leviticus, and it's a very similar construct. It also has this lamed here at Elohim, le Elohim, and it just says, I will be your God. And here the Greek translator has chosen to not include an article here. So this is like a very similar idea to what's happening. I know like Greek grammar people might be yelling at me, but I'm going to try to show you some similar things. There's a similar idea to what's happening in John 1, your God. And we have some similar things. I'm going to try and go a little bit quickly. I don't want to lose people. So this is the Lord, he is God. So here we have a nice mixture of the two divine names. So Yod He Vav He here, and Elohim here with the article Ha Elohim. So this is essentially saying like the Lord, he is the God almost, but we would just say in English, the Lord, he is God. So Kyrios ha theos, hutos theos estin. So this is a very similar construct to John 1:1. So the Lord God, he is God. But look, there's no article here. We would expect ha theos. You can see here, this one has an article. He is God. This one doesn't have an article. The Lord, he is God with no article. Now, I think this could be because in Hebrew, this is definite. So I think what this is actually saying, the Greek translator, I think, is reading this Hebrew with a definite article. This He in Hebrew is a definite article. So Ha Elohim is like saying the God, because one of the complicated things that is important to remember is that the authors of these texts were polytheistic. So when you're saying the Lord, he is God, it's not a statement about the ontology of God. It's about like which God is more powerful. It's about which God is more, I don't know, in a pantheon of gods, which is the God that's worth worshiping? Who's going to be my God? So there's cultural questions here too that I think even play into how we read John. And when you come through a lot of these translations of the Hebrew Bible, you'll see again and again that the word for God, you have this kind of thing. The Lord is God. Here it doesn't have the article. He knew himself that the Lord is God. And over here, Elohim, we have the same Elohim. Here, Yeah, Yod He Vav He, he is God. Again, we have the article here. Hey, I'm just editing and I realized I really didn't say this well. So I want to say this one more time with you here. Okay, so here we have the Lord, he is the God. But in Hebrew, we have this article, and I think this is actually interesting because this is actually referring to the unique God, the unique godness, can I say? The unique divinity of Yahweh, that Yahweh is the God. So including the article is actually like saying Yahweh is the God. So here the Greek translators try to do this by saying 4 different things here. Kyrios HaTheos. So first of all, the Lord, the God, hutos means this, theos estin. So the Lord, God, this one is God. They put it 4 times because they obviously had trouble with this. But I think it's important to notice that actually, if this theos without an article is standing in for ha-Elohim with an article, what you actually have is a case where you would probably argue that John 1:1, if it were doing this, and I'm not saying it is, but if it were doing this, is actually specifically referring to the God by saying this without an article. This is actually talking about the one true God as opposed to divinity. I just wanted to clear that up because I don't think I said it very well. Now, maybe this could be the Lord himself is divine if you're making this argument that we have in John 1:1, but it's hard to say. This could actually be talking about the Lord as being the one true God. I need some Hebrew scholars to weigh in here because my Hebrew isn't as good. But all I really want to show you is that again and again in the Hebrew Bible, we have, the Hebrew Bible to the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, we have something that looks very similar to what we see in John, which is theos with no article, Anarthrous theos. And sometimes it seems like maybe we could translate it as being divine, but sometimes it seems pretty clearly to be referring to the one, the one God, that he is God. So this, I don't think we're going to get an answer to our question from the Hebrew Bible and all the way that it translates. But at the very least, I think we should see that for somebody who's writing a gospel steeped in the Septuagint, this person is used to seeing theos without an article in a lot of different constructions. And that's probably important because it probably tells us that at the very least, the author of John was used to reading this. The author of John knew that often in referring to who God is, theos, that you don't always need to put an article. But I think there's a couple interesting things. The one other thing I want to point out from the Hebrew in particular is we actually have this other word for God in Hebrew, which is El. So Elohim is the way that gets specifically translated as the God, in the beginning, it's Elohim, who creates the heaven and the earth. So this was a divine name. But also El is just a more generic way to refer to a God. And here we have Psalm 117, we have this thing that says, the Lord is God and he has shone upon us. But in this case, El Yahweh, or El, I should say Hashem. I apologize to if there's any Jewish watchers who are offended by my pronouncing the divine name. And here I think we actually are dealing with something that sounds a little bit like the Lord is divine. And in Greek, it's just theos, kyrios. This is a very typical way to write this in Greek. Theos, we're supposed to read the word is here. So theos is kyrios. God is the Lord. English translation gets flipped the other way. So we already have from the Septuagint translators something that looks very similar to John's Gospel. And I think there's a lot going on here theologically, and it's more than I can really talk about in this video. It's probably more than, there are books that have been written on this. A lot of books have been written on this. So I can't really do it justice in a quick video, but I'm just going to try to point out that often this way of using theos without an article does appear, and kyrios as well. I think I grabbed a few down here, if you don't mind my scrolling. I grabbed a few here where you kind of see the same thing for kyrios with, so often Yod He Vav He gets translated as kyrios, the Lord, which if you have, like a King James Bible, they used to capitalize the divine name as Lord, L-O-R-D. So here we have kyrios HaTheos. So this is the reverse. This one, God, theos, has an article, but Lord doesn't have an article. So, and this is from the Shema. So all through these texts already, we have a well-established practice of sometimes not including articles when we're speaking about divinity. And I don't know if we should go through these and say that every single one deserves to be translated as God is a Lord. Certainly, I don't think that really makes sense, considering this is the divine name. This is literally the name revealed to Moses. So it's pretty obvious to me that there's more going on here than just being able to look at an Anarthrous noun and say that this signifies something, that it's impossible. So if you took that reading of John 1:1 to say that we should be reading John 1:1 as the Logos was divine, this, by that same logic, this should be like God, THEOS, was lordly. There's no verb here, but it's implied. This is actually an identical construction, and it doesn't really make any sense because this is actually the divine name in Hebrew. So in this text, which is super famous from the Hebrew Bible and in Greek as well, and would have been recited in a lot of synagogues, we actually literally have Kyrios HaTheos. We actually have a translation that has to be talking about God being the Lord. It has to be talking about the Lord is God, has to be talking about HaTheos is Yahweh. There's no other way to read this. You can't say he's lordly. It's obviously talking about the divine name. So if I come back up here to this example in John, I have to say that just by looking through the examples in the Septuagint of Anarthrous nouns, so of the places where Theos doesn't have an article in the Septuagint, what we actually get is a multitude of options. I think we actually do get through the Septuagint several cases where we could argue that this is the right translation, that divine or God in quality, the word was divine, and this would be the case with the Hebrew word el, especially, that gets translated without the article. But we also pretty clearly have a couple options that it has to be talking about the word was God. There's not really any other way to read the text. And unfortunately, I think as I go through the Septuagint, there's a little less case for the indefinite article, but there's still, you still could argue it, because in a polytheistic society, what one presumes that there are a lot of different gods out there. Saying things like "you will be my God" actually is an important way of saying "you will be a God to me." You will be, so there. It's, to me, it's complicated, but I think we have to leave this one in the running too. So all of these could be reasonable ways of reading this based on understanding the Septuagint. So what else can we look to try to get some purchase on what John is actually trying to say here? I think one of the places that I would look is Philo, and that's what I did here. So Philo of Alexandria was a Jewish philosopher in first century Alexandria. I wrote my master's thesis on Philo. I find Philo super interesting. I think not enough people read Philo to understand early Christianity, but Philo, before Jesus, before the Gospel of John, Philo already has a Jewish philosophy of the Logos, which in my mind looks a lot, it's not identical to what we see in John, but it's very, very similar. It's very, very related to how John understands the Logos. So much so that I don't actually think you get the Gospel of John without Philo, or if we can't create a direct translation or a direct relationship between Philo and John, at the very least, we could say that without people like Philo or philosophy done by people like Philo, we wouldn't have the Gospel of John. So one of the interesting things that Philo actually notices as he's reading the Septuagint, and Philo realizes exactly what I just showed you, that in a lot of cases, there isn't an article on the word for God. And Philo decides that this is actually something theological. So first of all, it's important to understand that Philo is steeped in Greek philosophy. Philo understands the Aristotelian idea of God. He understands the Greek philosophical idea of God. He's Jewish, he's a Jew, but he understands the Greek philosophical idea of God as the unmoved mover, that God is basically somewhere far off, and God can't speak, and God can't, do things or form the world, or God is the unmoved mover. But in order, this is something the Greeks came up with, in order for this unmoved mover, God, to actually do things, God needed to have an agent. And in Philo, as with some other Greek philosophers both before him and at his time, the agent is the Logos. The Logos is the agent of the unmovable God. So the only way that God can do stuff in the world is through God's Logos. The Logos is a Greek idea, and it gives God active power without the unmoved mover having to move. So there's lots of important discussion about who the Logos is in Philo, and I'm not even sure that Philo has one really well thought out argument for the Logos. He seems to flip-flop sometimes. But at the very least, Philo often seems to imply that the Logos is created by God, almost like a first creation, that is so that God himself can move, but he still calls the Logos divine. He still calls the Logos theos. The logos for Philo is how God creates everything else. And finally, and probably most importantly, the logos for Philo is still an extension of God. Now, would we say the logos was God? Well, here's Philo actually devotes a lot of time to this because Philo read the Septuagint, realized that often the word theos or God in the Septuagint didn't have an article, and he came up with an explanation for it. Now, it's not the right explanation. It's not true, but it's a very good window into reading the Gospel of John. So here in On Dreams, Philo talks about, he says, "It is not right for the man who anchors on the hope of the alliance of God to crouch and tremble, to whom God says, I am the God who is seen by thee in the place of God." So he's quoting Genesis. And what does Philo notice here in the Greek text in Genesis? Holy crap. Here's theos. So in this one, there's an article on God. And, in this one, we have this Anarthrous construction with no article. So now Philo's going to come up with an explanation for this. He's going to create an exegetical reason why this one doesn't have an article. What then ought we to say? There is one true God only, but they who are called gods by an abuse of language are numerous, on which account the Holy Scripture on the present occasion indicates that it is the true God that is meant by the use of the article, the expression being, I am the God. So when we have the article, theos, we're talking about the true God. But when the word is used incorrectly, it is put without the article. And here, the expression being, he who was seen by thee in the place, not of the God, to theo, but simply of God. So in the place of God. So this one doesn't have an article. And what he here calls God is his most ancient word. It's his most ancient logos. So Philo literally gives us a way to read the Septuagint that says when you have the article, theos, Philo says this is the unmoved mover. This is God. This is God like out there somewhere who never moves, but God who has a logos, who is the agent who God uses to create the world. Philo says when you see the article missing here, it's talking about the logos. Now, this is fascinating because you don't get to Christian Trinitarian theology without this move from Philo. I'm not saying Philo is a Trinitarian. Philo believes the logos is God, but Philo has this logos as an extension of God and a way for him to explain why the Septuagint often doesn't use an article in front of theou. And it would be a way to read the Septuagint and say, okay, we know, so he knows as a Greek philosopher, Philo says, okay, a Greek philosopher can't believe that the unmoved mover, shows up and talks to somebody face to face or somebody hears his voice or whatever. Like, that's not possible from a Greek philosophical principle. So Philo uses the logos as a way to explain all the actions of God in the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, or for him, Septuagint, where God actually does stuff, and God can do stuff because it's the logos. So already we are getting at something really fascinating for understanding John 1:1. And then coming down here, he says, for the living God is not of nature to be described, but only to be. Let's read. So important. For as those who are not able to look upon the sun itself, look upon the reflected rays of the sun as the sun itself, and upon the halo around the moon as if it were the moon itself, so also do those who are unable to bear the sight of God look upon his image, his angel word as himself. And this is the logos. So he says in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, Septuagint, I've got too many words I'm throwing around here, that when people looked on the face of God, they didn't look on the unmoved mover. They didn't look on theos. They didn't look on the God. They looked on theos, no definite article. They looked at the logos. You see here, you can see even just instinctively how this is creating space for what would become Christian theology. Super interesting. Okay, so further there are, as it seems, two temples belonging to God, one being this world in which the high priest is the divine word, his own firstborn son. Oh my God. So here he's calling the logos the firstborn son of God. So you are actually getting the roots of Christian theology here in Philo, this Jewish philosopher in Alexandria. And then he says the other is a rational soul, the priest of which is a real true man. So this is also important to notice. Philo doesn't think that this divine word is a human being at this point. He says the logos is God's firstborn son. Oh my God, it's such interesting stuff. Okay, so I need to keep going here. Let's read a little more from Philo from On Flight and Finding. The divine word, which is above these, does not come in any visible appearance, inasmuch as it is not like any of the things that come under the external senses, but is itself an image of God, the most ancient of all the objects of the intellect in the whole world, and that which is placed in closest proximity to the only true existing God. Oh, doesn't this just sound like the word was with God? Oh, without any partition or distance being interposed between them. Okay, I'm going to keep going. I need to keep going through here. This video is going to be 3 hours long. Okay, confusion of tongues. Philo says, and even if there be not as yet anyone who is worthy to be called a son of God, nevertheless, let him labor earnestly to be adorned according to his firstborn word, the firstborn logos, protogonon. It's the same word as protogenes, which becomes firstborn son. Protogonon, so the firstborn logos, the eldest of his angels and the great archangel. So here he's calling the logos the great archangel of many names, for he is called the authority, the name of God, and the word, and man according to God's image, and he who sees Israel. Okay, and let me jump down here. For even if we are not yet suitable to be called the sons of God, still we may deserve to be called the children of his eternal image, of his most sacred word, for the image of God is his most ancient word. And here, look at this, the image of God, logos icon. So because of God, again, no article here, the logos, hapresbutetos, so the most ancient, this is superlative, the most ancient logos is an image of God. Jeez, this is just wild. Like you're looking at the roots of what would become Christian theology. So imagine the Gospel of John writing in this world, the Gospel of John written in this world, and all of a sudden we've just seen in Philo, how many of these themes have we seen in Philo? He was in the beginning with God. We saw that in Philo. All things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. We saw that in Philo. Philo says that the Logos is like this agent of creation. I didn't show you in this, but another place Philo does talk about the Logos as the light as well. So you have these ideas that end up working their way into John, and the only real difference, the theological, the move that John makes that's really original theologically, is just to point to what Philo is saying, like, okay, there's the word, he's in the beginning with God, he is God, we'll finish talking about this, but he is God, or divine, and all things came into being through him, without him nothing comes into being, and then the main theological pivot of John is to say the word became flesh and lived among us. Anybody who has read Philo could get right to that point. Anybody who had read Philo could get all of John's theological arguments here and be like, yeah, we agree with that. We're nodding along with that. The word was God, blah, blah, blah. He was in the beginning. Okay, we're nodding along to that. And then he says, the word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a father's only son. And we already know Philo says that the Logos is the Son of God. So you quite seriously have a small Christian twist on Philo's philosophy. I want somebody to come after me in the comments, because there are people who understand the nuances of philosophy better than me. I'm just a historian more so than a philosopher, but this is just so fascinating. So let's come back to the Gospel of John here. I want to round this out, coming back to the question of theos and hologos without the article, because remember, that's where this all started. Why doesn't this have a definite article? Maybe I'll highlight it in pink. Oh, that's bright. But anyway, why doesn't this have a definite article? So I think we can say that if you read this through Philo, it actually makes some kind of sense, because we know that theos in Philo, without an article, is the way to talk about the Logos. The Logos is God. And Philo, remember, says every time you see theos in the Septuagint without an article, it's talking about the Logos. Is it best to translate that as divine? Is it best to translate that as God? It's confusing, because the Logos for Philo is created. It's the firstborn. It's like an extension of God, but it is still theos. It's still maybe divine. Maybe that's the right way to translate it. But I think we could actually get one final window into how to translate this by looking at some of the ways that John uses theos without an article, Anarthrous and otherwise. So I grabbed a bunch of these and put them in a chart. I should mention here, I didn't say this at the beginning, but there's kind of some ongoing question as to whether the prologue of the Gospel of John was composed separately and tacked onto the Gospel, or whether it fits with the whole thing. But in the prologue, you do get a little more from theos without an article. So here we have, there was a man sent from God whose name was John. Now, if I extend Philo's interpretation here, if the unmoved mover is doing something, this has to be the Logos. So it has to be God without an article. So there's a man sent from God. Now, I'm going to muddy the waters, because sometimes in Greek, especially with Greek with a quote-unquote Semitic background, articles just get dropped off after a preposition, which peta is. So I'm going to have to kind of put a pin in this and say, I think this could be interesting, but at the very least, the man sent from God, we wouldn't expect the unmoved mover to send anybody. We would expect the Logos to say, if somebody's doing something, a man sent from God would be the Logos. Okay, now here we have John 1, 12 and 13. To as many as received him, to them he gave the authority to be called the children of God. THEOS, no article. According to Philo's interpretation, I'm not saying necessarily that should be John's interpretation, this should be the children of God. So up until this point, I think we could maybe say that Philo's argument as a way of reading John might be holding up, that maybe we are talking about the Logos here, that anytime God does something, we're talking about a Logos without an article. But here's the fly in our ointment. John 1:18 says, no one has seen God at any time. And here we have Hudes, Herakin, Patote, Theon. No one has seen God. No article. And if you're saying no one has seen God at any time, the only begotten God who is in the bosom of the Father has explained him. This really creates, I think, one final messiness, because I think, tell me in the comments if you agree, I think this is talking about the unmoved mover. No one has seen God at any time, because the monogenes God, so the only begotten God, who is in the bosom of the Father, has explained him. So I don't know, maybe this is saying like no one has seen the Logos, but I don't know. I don't really see another way to read this other than to see this as referencing the unmoved mover. Nobody has seen God at any time. Maybe I'm wrong, but what would happen if we are seeing this and saying John here is using this to talk about the unmoved mover, to talk about like supreme God, to talk about, Yahweh, that we actually have something really difficult when we come back to the beginning, because here John is already using theos without an article to talk about God. Christians would later call God the Father. I don't think that necessarily makes sense to John as Trinitarian theology, but we have here just theon. And as you go through John, I said I'm not going to make my argument based on this, but you also have a lot of different things. So teacher, you said, we know you come from God, no article. We know nobody could do these signs you do unless theos is with him, unless God is with him. So this talking about God, the unmoved mover, maybe, I don't know. I think maybe you're supposed to read that. Our God here, John 8:54, the one who glorifies me. Anyway, I'm not going to go through all of these examples in John. I got so much good stuff here, but I can't make this video 2 hours long. So let's look really quick at a few of these comparisons between Philo and John, because I think it's really obvious that this is almost the same thing. Here we have Philo says the image of God, or the Logos is the image of God, the most ancient of all the objects of intellect in the whole world, and that which is placed in the closest proximity to the only true existing God, without any partition or distance being interposed between them. John says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. It's important that they are together. God, the Word was with God. And finally, this interesting thing, and even if there be not yet as anyone who is worthy to be called the Son of God, nevertheless, let him labor earnestly to be adorned according to the firstborn Word. And John actually gives us a way to become a son or a child of God. To all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God. So I want to stop there, but I think what I hope I've given you, if I come right back to the beginning and we look at these possibilities, I do think it's not a coincidence. I think John is trying to tell us something here. I think it could be that John is using Philo's category, that without an article, theos is talking about the Logos. I'm not as convinced, but it could be that John is following a Greek grammatical rule here, which I don't think I explained in detail at the beginning, but the Greek grammatical rule is that sometimes an anarthrous noun, when it's, oh my God, how am I going to do this? Okay, so in Greek, if you're talking about two things that are the same thing, okay, God is the Logos, God was the Logos. Sometimes in Greek, you're talking about two things that are identical, this first article will drop off. And this was famously what early interpreter of this named Colwell argued, is that what we actually have is a Greek grammatical rule that this is dropping off and that this is to be read as God. Or is this just like adjectival? We have, for example, in 1 John, God is love. And in that case, the word for love doesn't have the article either. I didn't grab the text. I think the thing that convinces me most when I look at this is I think John is doing theology here. I don't think this is a grammatical question. People have argued a lot over the basis of Greek grammar. John, as somebody who reads the Septuagint a lot, you're already muddying the waters of Greek grammatical rules. So if you look at John compared to a bunch of other Greek authors and say, like, here's what we know based on Greek grammar, it's very difficult to say John, that you can understand John based on the rules of Greek grammar, because we know that John is reading a book, the Septuagint, and maybe Philo, in which having no article on this is actually significant. So I'm not really convinced that there's just a Greek grammatical explanation for this. I think John is making a theological point. I think the thing that's most likely, based on the texts that I've showed you today, is that this is saying hologos is theos, and that theos here does function as God. You could translate it God, but that we're not talking about God, the unmoved mover. We're talking about God, the active power of God in the world. But if you're adopting Philo's philosophy, this would still be God, but it's confusing. So here's my conclusion. I lean towards translating this as logos was divine. The word was divine. However, if that is our decision, based on what we've already looked at with every occasion where theos is missing the article in John, you should consider each of those possibilities. So for example, where it says, to as many as received him, to those he gave the power to be called the children of God, the tekna theou with no article, is that actually meaning the children of the divine? Because I think we could make the argument that John is actually talking about being the children of the Logos, not children of the unmoved mover. I know I'm applying Philo's categories to John, but I think as I've kind of shown, you might have to consider this. So I think divine gets a vote if you're going to consistently apply that logic and go through the Gospel of John and translate this as divine. But if you are setting out to translate John 1:1 as an intro to a book where throughout the entire Gospel of John, you have translated theou without an article as just God, like children of God. No one has seen God at any time, the only begotten God. All of these things should be re-examined. And if we aren't going to re-examine them, we're just going to leave them as God. Then I actually think it makes more sense to translate John 1:1 as in the beginning, the Word was with God and the Word was God, because you have continuity then that it's actually God, we're children of God, that it's God doing this stuff all the way through. So that's my confusion, that's my contention, and I hope that makes some sense after having watched this video. At the end of the day, it's more than just a question of how we translate John 1:1. It's a question of how we could translate this concept of the Logos better throughout the Gospel of John, so that the English reader doesn't just hear God all the way through, but can understand that there could be a difference between theos, the God, but God, the supreme being, and theos, perhaps the philonic active power of God, the Logos. There is a difference. So that's my very unsatisfying answer to how to translate John 1 verse 1. And I don't think I've necessarily answered the question really well, but I hope I've kind of explained to you why there is a question in the first place, why it's complicated, and maybe given some beginnings of how to understand how we might translate it. At the very least, I've probably just confused you and thrown a bunch of Greek and Hebrew at you. But if you are still with me, if you were able to follow all of this, then well done. You are as much a language nerd as I am. But I hope this is at least interesting to you, and I hope it helps you think differently about what would become later Trinitarian theology. And I hope you can see a little glimpse into how these ideas were being worked out by the author of John's Gospel. Please absolutely comment down below. Let me know what you think. I'd love to hear some other interpretations of this. And as I've kind of talked today, I've spanned from like Septuagint studies to Philo to John and none of these, like all of these are fields of study in themselves. It's difficult to jump back and forth. And as I said at the beginning, my Hebrew is not as good as it could be. So anybody with any other skills who want to weigh in or different perspectives, I'd love to hear what you have to say about this. Take a second, leave a comment down below. All comments welcome, even if you're going to tell me that my Greek or Hebrew sucks, which I kind of know. If you haven't already done so, please do take a minute to subscribe to the channel. I promise my deep dives are not always as nerdy and detailed as this one, but I do have lots of good stuff coming up on early Christianity and a little bit on modern Christianity too. And for me, that's it for today. Thank you so much for being here. I'll see you next time.